Now, do we call it the predominant mentality of such an era, or just sheer cruelty and detest for a people not like they are? History informs us that between about 1500 and 1900, Europeans forcibly uprooted millions of people from throughout West Africa and West Central Africa and shipped them across the Atlantic in conditions of great cruelty. What could have inspired that level of animosity? To refer to the Africans who were enslaved only as slaves strips them of their identity. They were, for instance, farmers, merchants, priests, soldiers, goldsmiths, and musicians. They were husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. European slavers dispersed them across the Americas to lead lives of degradation and brutality without thought for their personal lives. Millions died in the process. As a result, people of African descent are spread throughout the Americas and Western Europe. This is called the African diaspora. In this video, we are taking a dive into what it feels like to live life aboard a slave ship. You shall be intimated with details on the horrendous events inside what is called a slave ship, on the lives of blacks captured against their will and turned to slaves in the wink of an eye. Hit the thumb button to support our works as we proceed. Share content with as many as you can, and subscribe to stay with us if you are yet to. Your support means a lot to us. Let's take a dive in. Slave ships were large cargo ships specially converted for the purpose of taking slaves, especially newly captured African slaves, to the Americas. Living conditions for slaves on these ships was awful. Men, women, and children were crowded into every possible space, leaving no room to move or even breathe. There was little food, and the smell could not be described. Between 1526 and 1867, about 12.5 million slaves were sent by slave ships from Africa to the Americas. But only about 10.7 million slaves actually arrived, meaning that 1.8 million had died in the Middle Passage. Of all human migrations, this had caused the most human deaths. The average time to sail across the Atlantic was 60 to 90 days. Sometimes the trips took up to 4 months. Traders set out from European ports towards Africa's west coast. There they bought people in exchange for goods and loaded them into the ships. While Europeans owned and operated the slave ships, the work of kidnapping new victims was generally left to West Africans, whom they have successfully lured into the ungodly activity. Bands of slavers would roam the African countryside, preying on villagers who let their guard down. Olaudah Equiano, who was abducted when he was 8 years old, has his own side of the story to tell.
When all our people were gone out to their works as usual, and only I and my dear sister were left to mind the house, 2 men and a woman got over our walls and in a moment seized us both, and without giving us time to cry out or make resistance, they stopped our mouths and ran off with us into the nearest wood. Here they tied our hands and continued to carry us as far as they could till night came on, when we reached a small house where the robbers halted for refreshment and spent the night. We were then unbound, but were unable to take any food, and being quite overpowered by fatigue and grief, our only relief was some sleep.
It sometimes took several months to transport captives to the coast, and they were often sold and resold to several new owners along the way. Once they reached the coast, some captives were taken to slave forts or compounds where they waited for a slave vessel to arrive. Many of these fortresses still stand on the coasts of Africa, at places like Elmina and Gorée Island, as ruined monuments to the cruel economy of years past. Once a ship was ready, the Africans were handed over to their new captors, Europeans and Americans, who would take them on their journey to the Americas. Ship captains were under orders by slavers to deliver only saleable slaves. Starving, sick, or troublesome slaves were often thrown overboard into the ocean to drown. Sometimes Africans were kept on deck chained together with long chains. There were times when these captives would jump overboard, taking every other chained slave with them to avoid their unknown fate. Many ships kept extra crew members on deck to prevent this from happening. At other times, crew members would throw slaves overboard as a warning to other slaves. If the ship was running out of food or water, all the slaves would be killed to save the crew from starving. Slave ships could at times get insurance on their cargoes of slaves, but insurance would not pay if the slavers starved the slaves or they got sick. Insurance paid out if the slaves drowned, but not if they were severely starved to death. In 1781, the slave ship Zong was hauling 470 slaves, which was more than the ship could handle. Many began to get sick. By the time the ship reached the doldrums, a mid-Atlantic region that at times had no wind, several of the crew had died from the spreading diseases. To save themselves, the remaining crew threw 132 dying and sick slaves into the ocean. Another 10 slaves had also jumped with them. When they tried to collect the insurance underwriter denied the claim, which had led to a court case in 1782, and a court in Jamaica ruled for the owners. This occurrence would attract a great deal of public attention then. No member of the crew or the owners were ever charged with murder.
Chapter 8. The Forced Migration. The process of capture and transport was set in motion by the slave trade that changed maritime history, economic history, and created an immigrant population in the Caribbean islands and in the Americas who were forced out of their homes against their will. The basis of this force was the need and greed of Europe. Their forced migration was a process that ignored the humanity of a large portion of humankind. This process, set in motion during the latter part of the 15th century, would last over 300 years until slavery was turned into colonization, a more sophisticated form of slavery. There is a need now to look at this process and how it was set in motion. Most of the information used for this examination is taken from the article, African Slave Trade, The Cruelest Commerce, by Colin Palmer, professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Also from Basil Davidson's Black Mothers, The Years of African Slave Trade, and A. Adu Boahen's The Coming of the Europeans, Horizon History of Africa. To set the process in motion, the African was totally dehumanized in the minds of the Europeans. So far as most of them were concerned, the Africans were outside of the grace of God. Africans became living commodities in the world trade system that laid the basis for modern capitalism. The Middle Passage, the condition of the transfer of the Africans across the Atlantic to the various ports of embarkation where they were to be sold as slaves, is the most tragic story of forced migration in human history. Europe took full advantage of wars and conflicts between West African tribes and nations and began to purchase some of the captives and prisoners of war as slaves. The kind of slavery that the European was about to introduce into West Africa had no relationship to the African system of indentured servitude. In the African system, the slave was usually a loser in a local war. He was not enslaved separate from his family, and no slave was sent outside of Africa. Some slaves with talent rose to be kings in the very house to which they had been slaves. The word slave in West Africa had an entirely different meaning than it had when the Europeans used it. The slave in Africa did not lose his or her humanity. Some African chiefs or kings became corrupt and went into the slave trade because they wanted to. The Europeans sold firearms to one African group to either protect themselves or to capture another group. The European gunpowder, rum, and cheap bric-a-brac coming from the embryo of what will eventually become the European Industrial Revolution was traded for slaves. In every slave fort in West Africa, there is a door of no return. The captured slaves went out of this door to the beach and subsequently to the boats that would take them away from their home forever. The condition on these boats was beyond anything described in a concentration camp or in a chain gang in the South of the 1920s and 1930s. Professor Colin Palmer described the condition, the establishment of these slaveholding forts in the following manner. So this is Professor Colin Palmer's writing. To facilitate trade, forts were established along the West Coast. The Gold Coast saw construction of more than 50 such posts along 300 miles of coastline. The larger forts were called castles. Among the best known, Elmina Castle in Ghana was built by the Portuguese in 1482, but fell to the Dutch in 1637. Cape Coast Castle, begun by the Swedes in 1653, was later held by the Dey or ruler of the Fetu people. It was acquired by the Dutch in 1664 and by the English in 1665. This castle could accommodate more than 1,000 slaves. And so Professor Palmer continues his writing by saying the following: the Atlantic Passage tested bodies and souls to their limits. The human cargoes were arranged on wooden platforms like books on the shelf on various levels in the cramped hold. Rarely was there space for an adult to stand erect. Some had barely enough room to lie down. One ship's surgeon observed that the traders wedged them in so that they had not so much room as a man in his coffin, either in length or breadth. It was impossible for them to turn or shift with any degree of ease. Some traders, of course, realized that such crowding increased the incidence of disease and death. One agent of the Royal African Company complained in 1704 of inadequate space on the ship. And he was called postulation. The slaves are so large, and excuse me, this was his postulation. The slaves are so large, it began the general opinion that the slaves could not be healthy in the space of 3 foot. They broke up one of the platforms, which was the reason she couldn't carry more than 100 slaves. 8 years later, the company advised its agents at Cape Coast Castle, pray laid no more than are necessary to prevent mortality, which was often happened by crowding the ship with too many Negroes. Not until the 18th century did European countries engage in the trade set standards for the allocation of space to the slaves. It may be doubted whether the rules were obeyed. Fearing rebellion, ship's crews generally chained the slaves securely to the hold, usually in pairs, the right ankle of one connected to the left ankle of another. James Penny, who commanded trading vessels for more than 20 years, recounted that when no danger is apprehended, their fetters are by degrees taken off. With so many bodies closely packed together, the heat below decks became unbearable. The air reeked of excrements and infected sores. By the 18th century, ships customarily had portholes to aid ventilation, wind sails to throw down a current of air, and gratings on the deck. But to the human cargo, the whole remained a fetid hell, right? And so that was writings by Dr. Colin Palmer. So a cruel philosophical argument developed among the slave traders between the concept of tight pack and loose pack. When the slaves were tightly packed on the ship, more could be loaded on, but more died. In loose pack, more survived the journey because they had breathing space because fewer slaves were packed on the ship. Therefore, when slaves arrived at the port of debarkation, they were in a healthier condition. The argument would go on for another 100 years. There's a small library of literature on the Middle Passage, some written by captains of slave ships. The rationale and the pretense in England was that the slave was primitive, unchristian, and that slavery brought them under the tutelage of Christianity. Other slave trading nations took the same attitude. The best literature illustrating this rationale came from the Catholic and Protestant Church. It is time that we look, at least briefly, at slavery and what is referred to as the New World and how it developed. Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back. Happy Monday, and welcome back to On the Shoulders of Giants. I am Joseph Ward, and I am continuing my reading of Dr. John Henry Clarke's book, Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Colonialism. And I started on chapter 8, The Forced Migration, which is on page 77. And give a big shout out to the Black Journals YouTube channel. That's the video clip I had at the beginning showing the conditions and the actions of the forced migration and the actual them being forced into the transatlantic slave trade, because that's what we're getting into today. But before we get deep into it, I do want to make sure you hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and share this video. Thank you to everybody who continues to support this channel and spread this information. I want to make sure that we can get this information out to more people. So please continue to share this content, to get in the comments, to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and you can become a member of the channel. And speaking of that, I want to give a big shout out to Professor Carl Tone Jones for becoming a member of the On the Shoulders of Giants channel. And then make sure y'all check out Professor Carl Tone Jones's book. It is on his website, and I put the link in the description. 2020 Through the Eyes of a Social Media Revolutionary by Professor Carl Tone Jones. So make sure y'all check it out. I want to give a big shout out to the big homie for the support and becoming a member of the channel. Okay, stuff is falling. And so also make sure y'all get a copy of Pat's book, The Chasm. Great book. The Growing Divide Between Black Men and Women. It's a book he wrote a long time ago. It's a great book. Give a lot of good information about how the divide between Black men and Black women happened, the contributions to it, especially the contributions by white supremacy that led and continue to lead to the growing divide, the chasm between Black men and Black women. And oh shoot, want to give another shout out. This fell to Anthony Asoda. So I was had a chance to be a part of at the Pan-African Connection documentary by Anthony Asoda. And, you know, we talked about that, and I put that link in the description. So this is the first poster of the documentary release. So the first poster, and he signed it on the back. So I appreciate this. This is special. This is some kind of classic. This is a classic. So I appreciate it. I was able to be a part of the documentary, and you know, I was able to help him do some things, and I appreciate the opportunity to be able to help you, Anthony, and I wish you the best with your documentary. I think you have a great documentary, so y'all make sure y'all check that out. Link is in the description for that. But this is going on the wall. I'm gonna have to get this framed to put this on the wall. Let me put this over here so it's safe. But you know, getting into how we got to where we are today, how America became America, how the world became the world, how Europe became Europe. Europe needed the bodies of the African people. They tried it with the white indentured servants, it didn't work. They tried it with the Native Americans and the Tainos in the Caribbean, it didn't work. But it did work with Africans. And they took more and more and more and more and more. And they forced us on boats, forced our ancestors on boats, and brought them to the Caribbean, Europe, South America, Central America, North America, right? Dispersed us throughout the world, created a global diaspora. Instead of a continental diaspora, created a global diaspora, right? And so we're talking about the forced migration, which is leading up to the new world, the development of this new world for the Europeans, for these specific groups of Europeans, right? The new world. And to develop this new world, they needed the labor. So of course, you know, the African labor became that labor to help them develop the new world. The labor that the Africans was providing for them was very, very, very valuable, right? Very valuable. But also in this reading, we're learning about one of our superpowers, the resilience, because Dr. Clark included in the book the information from Colin Palmer, from Professor Colin Palmer, about the conditions that were on the slave ships, the horrible, dehumanizing conditions that the ancestors had to go through, the ones who did survive, right? They had horrible conditions in the slave castles, in the castles along the Gold Coast. Those 50 castles, they had horrible conditions in the castles, horrible conditions in the hulls of these ships, and the horrible conditions for those who made it on the plantations. Now, we're going to get into the difference between the plantations in the United States and the plantations in Central and South America and throughout the Caribbean, right? The reason the United States became the powerhouse that it was able to become, the Industrial Revolution and all these things that was able to set up to that, how cotton and sugar and all these other crops that made America what it was, because the dehumanization of the African, treating the African as a tool and socializing the African to think of themselves as tools. It's a total reworking of our mindsets, right? And that's still happening to this day. So the total process was to break the total spirit of the African. Think about it. That's the only reason that those conditions were needed, to help further break them mentally and spiritually and emotionally and psychologically. Because they were also going to work to break them physically. And that way you get to create a new Negro in America. And that's how we got to where we are today. So let's get back into this reading. So this is page 81, chapter 9, the slave trade in the New World. Remember, we're starting off on the forced migration, the conditions, how the Africans were actually treated by the Europeans, how the Africans were treated by some other Africans, how the Africans were treated by some Native Americans, right? But all that was to create a new Negro to help create a new world. So here we are. The Africans were not strangers to the New World. They seem to have been in North America and South America long before Columbus. This is more than an assumption. Thanks to the research of Professor Leo Weiner, reported in his Africa and the Discovery of America, and the work of Harold G. Lawrence in another book called African Explorers to the New World. The first Africans who came to the New World were not in bondage, contrary to popular belief. Africans participated in some of the early expeditions, mainly with Spanish explorers. The best known of these African explorers was Estevanico. Estevanico, sometimes known as Little Stephen, and accompanied by De Vaca expedition during 6 years of wandering from Florida to Mexico. The remarkable thing about Estevanico, who came to America in 1527, is that he was a remarkable linguist. He learned the language of the Indians in a matter of weeks. Because of his knowledge of herbs and medicines, he was accepted as a deity by some Indian tribes. In 1539, Estevanico set out from Mexico in a party with Fray Marcos de Niza in search for the fabulous 7 cities of Cibola. When most of the expedition, including Fray Marcos, became ill, Estevanico went on alone and opened up what is now known as New Mexico and Arizona. So laying the groundwork, letting you know that, yes, there was a forced migration to America, but that wasn't the first time African people set foot in the Americas. A number of historians have stated that Pedro Niño, one of the pilots of the command ship of Christopher Columbus, was an African. In the discovery of the Pacific in 1513, Balboa carried 30 Africans who helped to clear the road across the isthmus between the two oceans. In the conquest of Mexico, Cortez was accompanied by a number of Africans. Incidentally, one was a pioneer of wheat farming in the New World. In the exploration of Guatemala, Chile, Peru, and Venezuela, Africans arrived nearly 100 years before they reappeared as slaves in Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. Thus, Africans were major contributors to the making of the New World, and they did not come culturally empty-handed. Many of the Africans brought to the New World such skills as ironworking, leatherworking, and carpentry. Before the breaking up of the social structure of the West African states, such as Ghana and Songhai, the internal strife that made the slave trade possible, many Africans, especially West Africans, lived in a society in which university life was fairly common and scholars were held in reverence. In that period in West African history, the University of Sankore at Timbuktu was flourishing, and its great chancellor, the last of the monumental scholars of West Africa, Ahmed Baba, reigned over the university. The great African scholar, he wrote 47 books, each on a separate subject. He received all of his education within Africa. In fact, he did not leave the Western Sudan until he was expelled to Morocco during the invasion in 1594. My point is this: there existed in Africa prior to the beginning of the slave trade a cultural way of life that in many ways was equal, if not superior, to many of the cultures then existing in Europe. And the slave trade destroyed these cultures and created a dilemma that the African has not been able to extract himself from to this day. There were the Africans' past rulers who extended kingdoms into empires, great armies and subdued entire nations, generals who advanced the technique of military science, scholars with wisdom and foresight, and priests who who hold, and priests who told of gods that were kings and strong. But with the bringing of the African to the New World, with every effort was made to destroy his memory and having to ever been a part of a free and intelligent people. This was part of the dehumanization of the African. Break the mind and the spirit of the African. Make the African believe that they were born to be subservient. That way the new world can be built. The greatest destroyer of African culture, the greatest exploiter of the African was the plantation system of the New World. The African was transformed into something called a Negro, that Negro mindset that I always be talking about. He was determined, he was demeaned. This is the thing that is unlikely tragic about the African slave system. Of all the slave systems in the world, no other dehumanized the slave more than that started by the Europeans in the 15th century. Using the church as a rationale, they began to set up myths that always read the African out of human history, beginning with the classification of the African as a lesser being. The Catholic Church's justification for slavery was that the African was being brought under the guidance of Christendom and that he would eventually receive his blessings. They never came. The blessings have never came. The rationale was that slavery was a blessing to the African, and it was not. There were several competing slave systems in the New World. In order to understand the effects of these various systems on the personality of the Africans, we have to look at each one individually. In Cuba and Haiti, often the Africans were a majority in the population. This is also true of certain portions of Brazil. Therefore, the system operated differently in these areas, and although it was still slavery, the African had some cultural mobility. In South America and in the West Indies, the slave master did not outlaw the African drum, African ornamentations, African religion, or other things dear to the African, remembered from his former way of life. This permitted a form of cultural continuity among the slaves in the West Indies, Cuba, and South America that did not exist in the United States. In the United States, they said no cultural continuity. They broke the African on a whole nother level in the United States. The mental degradation was on 10 with the slave masters in the US. In the Portuguese area in the West Indies and often in South America, the plantation owner would buy a shipload of half a shipload of slaves. These slaves usually come from the same areas in Africa, and they naturally spoke the same language and had the same basic culture. Families in the main were kept together. If a slave on an island was sold to a plantation owner at the other end of the island, he could still walk to see his relatives. This made for a form of cultural continuity among the slaves in South America, Cuba, and Haiti that later made their revolts more successful than revolts in the United States. In the United States, in the fight to destroy every element of culture of the slaves, the system was cruel. No other system did so much to demean the personality of the slave, to deny his personality, or to ruthlessly sell family members away from each other. The American slave system operated almost like the American brokerage system. If a person brought 20 slaves at the beginning of the week and found himself short of cash at the end of the week, he might, if the price is right, sell them. These men might be resold within a week or a few days. The most meaningful entity in African life, was systematically and deliberately destroyed. But in South America, the slave managed to stay in his group and therefore preserve some of his cultural continuity. In spite of these drastic drawbacks, the African in the Americas, including the United States, made a meaningful contribution to the preservation of the countries in which he was a slave. And that shows a testament to the resilience that we do have. Like, the Africans in the United States faced the cruelest form of slavery, and yet we managed to come out to become one of the leading groups of Black people in the world. So that shows that we have something great about ourselves that we've forgotten. That's why we have to learn our history. We got to study. We got to study. Sleeping giants. We're sleeping giants. All we got to do is wake up and realize who we are. And it's over. I'm telling you. Another neglected aspect of the African New World is the role of the African woman. Comparatively to white women, were brought to the New World during the first 100 years. Many families of the New World originated from cohabitation between the white slave master and the African woman. Later, this slave master, especially in the United States, made and supported laws forbidding his own child to have an education or sit beside him in public transportation. In Haiti, the African woman sometimes had a kind of semi-legal status. In South America, especially in Brazil, sometimes the white slave master married the African woman and she became a free person. These free African women in South America began to maneuver their husbands in an attempt to lessen the harshness of the slave system. In the United States, however, there could be no such maneuver. Haiti and Cuba during this early period were dominated by their mother countries. Wars were started within these countries to liberate them from the European masters. Africans made a meaningful contribution toward the early liberation of Cuba, Haiti, and other areas of South America. They fought with Simon Bolivar for the freedom of South America. And if you don't know about Simon Bolivar, got to look his story up. And fought valiantly to free Haiti from the domination of the French. In the United States, especially in the American Revolution, the African slave often took the place of the white person who decided that he did not want to fight and fought with the promise that he would get his freedom afterward. Thousands of Africans fought in the American Revolution with this promise. And a little known incident in our history is that thousands of Africans fought with the British when the British made the same promise that the African believed them. Apparently, it depended on who got to the Africans first to promise them freedom to fight for them, right? The African was a major contributor in the making of the New World. The economy of the New World rested largely on slave labor. For many years, 1/3 of the trade of the New World was the small island of Santo Domingo, which later became Haiti. Haiti and other Caribbean islands also influenced the economic system of Europe. Slavery and the slave trade was the first international investment in capital. It was the first large-scale investment that was intercontinental. Many Europeans invested in ships and in the goods and services taken from these African countries and became independently wealthy. But the slave revolts continued by the end of the 17th century. The picture of slavery began to change drastically. Economic necessity, not racial prejudice, originally directed the African slave trade to the New World. As nearly as 1663, a group of slaves joined a group of white indentured servants in a revolt. The slaves took the Christian version of the Bible literally and believed that God meant for them to be free men. Slaves such as Gabriel Prosser in Virginia, who led a revolt of 40,000 slaves in 1800. In 1822, in Charleston, South Carolina, a carpenter, Denmark Vesey, planned one of the most extensive slave revolts on record. But he was betrayed and put to death with many of his followers. Sellout blacks, right? And in 1831, Nat Turner led the greatest slave revolt ever to occur in Virginia. The slaves never accepted their condition passively. In this book, American Negro Slave Revolts, Dr. Herbert Aptheker records over 250 slave revolts. The African slave in the Americas, in addition to assisting in the freedom and the economy of these countries, made a major contribution to his freedom. And remember, those were the recorded slave revolts. There were other things and other forms of resistance that slaves had. So it was more than just 250 acts of slave resistance during the 400 years of slavery, or the 200-something years of physical enslavement, right? There were more than 250 incidents. In the story of the rise and fall of the great African states and subsequently the slave trade, we're trying to deal with something much bigger than history itself. We're trying to deal with an old situation and a new situation and trying to address ourselves to the current cry for Black history and Black power. Our major point is this: the African people who became slaves in the United States have been many things in history, good and bad. They have ruled great nations and they have destroyed great nations. They are profoundly human and they have played every role in the human drama. From the saint to the buffoon, slavery does not represent the sum total of our history. We are searching for a definition of our African heritage and to determine what it means to a people emerging from bondage into the light of freedom, re-entering the mainstream of world history and as participants. A good definition of heritage or history. Now, listen to this. A good definition of heritage or history is heritage is something acquired or transmitted by a predecessor. It is also called a legacy, a tradition, a birthright. But when we speak of our people, perhaps a new and better definition is in order. In his book, Tom Tom, John Vandercook said, a race is like a man. Until he uses his own talent, takes pride in his own history, and loves his own memories, it can never fulfill itself completely. Heritage, in essence, is how people have used their talents to command the respect of other people. The ultimate purpose of our heritage and the heritage teaching is to show our people how through identity and through respect for themselves, they can work to liberate themselves from the old ties of bondage. A person's relationship to his heritage, after all, is the same relationship to a mother of his child. And that will end our reading for today. And that is chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 9 is the slave trade in the New World, start on page 81. And chapter 8 is the forced migration, start on page 77. So we talked about how we got here and what happened when we got here. Of course, by now we know a lot more details about the transatlantic slave trade than we knew in the past. Years later, even when we were young, we know a lot more about the transatlantic slave trade, the role Africans played, the role Europeans played, and how Africans were played by the Europeans, right? And so it's now on us to take this information and use this information, take this information and curate this information. Make sure the younger generations have this information, understand this information, and can utilize this information to make their situation better, to make their lives better, right? Historical information, right? Why are we learning about Christopher Columbus? Why is Christopher Columbus important, right? He set in motion, like Dr. Clark keeps saying, he set in motion the events that led to us being to where we are today. He set in motion what will lead to the rise of white supremacy on the global scale. Because white supremacy was already trying to rise during the Crusades. But after the Crusades, and off the heels of the transatlantic slave trade, white supremacy became a thing and it became a global phenomenon. And then racism came about to justify the rise of white supremacy. So now with the system of racism, white supremacy moving forward, the globe has been colonized. And so we're learning this because we don't want to be colonized by white supremacists anymore. So we're learning this information to help us understand what we can do about it, so we can no longer be under the thumb of white supremacy. So that's how it's going, man. That's how it's going. So make sure y'all hit that like button, comment, subscribe, share, so we can continue getting this information out so more people can learn this information and grow from this information. Christopher Columbus and the African Holocaust, Slavery and the Rise of European Capitalism. Link is in the description to get your copy. If you don't have it already, make sure you get that. Make sure you check out Pat's book, The Chasm. Make sure you check out Professor Carl Tone Jones's book, 2020 Through the Eyes of a Social Media Revolutionary. Shout out to Anthony. Shout out to Anthony and Soda at the Pan-African Connection documentary. Make sure you check it out. And I'm Joseph Ward. Check out my website, ontheshoulders1.com. Make sure you get your copies of my books, On the Shoulders of Giants, volumes 1, 2, 3, and 4. Volume 1 is covering North America, volume 2, Central America, volume 3, South America, volume 4, the Caribbean, and telling these stories about Columbus and how they helped to dismantle things, but also our heroes who fought back, because we always fought back. Between North, Central, and South America, there was so many revolts, so many forms of resistance against the enslavement that was inflicted upon us by white supremacists. But having a great understanding of the why behind the actions, that's what gets us to where we need to go. I'm Joseph Ward. I love you all. Hit that like button. Love y'all. Catch the next video coming up. Have a great Monday.